Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the Abrahamic Covenant in our continuing study of Old Testament theology. We're introduced, actually, he's first seen in Genesis chapter 11, but we're going to open up in Genesis chapter 12, where the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you." Now, when he says go forth from your country, that word country, aretz, is the Hebrew word. It's the same word that was translated back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the aretz, the same term there. There it was translated in the earth. Here it's translated country, and both of those are legitimate translations. And from your relatives and from your father's house to the aretz, same term, even though our translators, notice they translated to earth back in Genesis 1:1, country at the beginning of this verse, and land at the later on in the verse, and it's the same term. And it carries each of these ideas all at the same time, because remember the people of the ancient world didn't have a telescope, and they'd never seen pictures of planet Earth from out in space. So the Earth, the land, the country, that's the stuff down here. And I'm going to have you go, God says, from this stuff down here where you're at here to the stuff that's down here over there, to that other place. And so he's leaving his land, his country, his people, his sort of sphere of influence to go to a new place. Verse 2, "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing." And notice the double reference to blessing. I'm going to bless you, but you're also going to be a blessing. And then he's going to come back and talk about that in verse 3. Verse 3, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse." So there's both blessings and cursing. But notice we come back to the blessing in the last line. "And in you, all the families of the earth," and this time it's Adama, a different word for earth. Adama is the place from which Adam was taken. In fact, you can sort of hear where the words sound familiar. So Adama is the word for earth or ground, the stuff from which Adam, the first man, was taken. And that takes us, in a sense, back to Genesis chapter 3, where we saw a curse that had come upon the land, upon the ground, upon Adama. Remember, the ground will be cursed because of you. Thorns and thistles, it will come forth, and it will be difficult for you to make your living from the ground. That had been the curse placed upon man because of his rebellion against God. But now we see a promise of blessing, not just to Abram, but to all the families of the earth, all the families of the ground, all the families of that realm that had previously been cursed. And so there's a sense in which we can take these opening verses of Genesis chapter 12 as a promise to undermine and undergird and overcome that curse that had been given earlier in Genesis 3. That God is going to bring redemption, and he's going to do it through one man, through Abram. And of course, then there's a sense in which the rest of the Old Testament is going to expand on this promise, how God's going to do that. Now, the story of Abram is going to be presented in sort of an inverse detail. Let me walk you through this very quickly. We see these opening promises given, where Abram is called to leave his family, and there's a promise of a seed, of this one that's going to come through Abram. And then he comes down into Canaan. He leaves the place where he had been born, comes down into Canaan. But there's a famine in Canaan, and so he goes from there to live in Egypt as a sojourn in Egypt, and he gets in a little bit of trouble there. If you're not familiar with the story, he says about his wife, she's not my wife, she's my sister. You find out later on, he's trying to protect himself. But God steps in and intervenes, and everything's okay. And so they come back out of Egypt. And when they do come back out of Egypt, we have Abram and his wife, but also his nephew Lot. And they both have a great many servants, and they both have a great deal in cattle, and too much for them to live in the land together. It's not that their cattle is that much. You say, how much cattle can you have that you can't live in the land? Well, there's other people in the land. All the best land is already taken, so they're having to live already on the outskirts. But now that's getting to be crowded between the two of them. And so they enter into negotiations, and they agree to separate, and Lot goes down to the valley, which is the Jordan Rift Valley, where there's a number of cities, but one of those cities is the city of Sodom. And then in chapter 14, Abram goes to rescue Lot and the people of Sodom, who've been carried off into captivity by some raiders. And we're not going to go into the historical details. We're looking for the theology in this course, but there's other courses where I teach on that, and you're welcome to go and see those lectures. Next, we have Genesis chapter 15, where Abram is told to prepare a sacrifice for a covenant ceremony. We're going to look at that today. We're going to look at that in just a few minutes. And God promises descendants in the land, and he has promised to give Abram a son, but didn't say where the son was going to come from. And so Abram and Sarah come up with this plan where Abram is going to have a son by Sarah's handmaiden, and her name is Hagar. And so he does have a son by her. That son's name is Ishmael. So you have the story of Hagar and Ishmael in chapter 16. And then the central part of the Abram story takes place as everything's moving to this central location. The Abrahamic Covenant is going to be laid out in chapter 17, the first part of the chapter. Abraham's name is going to be changed from Abram to Abraham. And then after that, you're going to have a sign of the covenant, and it's going to be circumcision. And both Abraham and his son Ishmael are circumcised there. So you had Ishmael introduced in chapter 16. You have them both circumcised in the latter part of chapter 17. Then you have a story where God comes and visits Abraham, and he prepares a meal, and he gives promises that Abraham's going to have another son, not Ishmael, but a son that will come through Sarah. And she's going to give birth to a son, and she thinks, in fact, she's listening at the sort of the tent, and she starts laughing about that, because not only is she barren, by now she's quite old. And God gets the last laugh, and they are going to name that child Laughter. The word laughter, the way you say it in Hebrew, is Yitzhak, or we say Isaac. That's what his name means. His name means laughter. Next, there's another story where God, actually it's part of that story, where God is speaking to Abraham and tells Abraham that the city of Sodom is going to be destroyed. And Abraham says what is thinking. You can hear him thinking. He doesn't actually say this, but he knows that Lot his nephew lives in Sodom. And so he bargains, he negotiates with God. And then angels go down and rescue Lot and his two daughters, and his wife turns back and she dies. But God destroys the city of Sodom. So there's a rescue story there. Another rescue story. A sojourn, this time in Gerar, which is near to the land of the Philistines. And there's another story, she's my sister. And finally, toward the end of the Abraham story, this isn't quite the end of his life, but it sort of brings you full circle in the Abraham narrative. Remember, we started off with promises being given. Now the promises are fulfilled with the birth of Isaac, and Hagar and Ishmael are sent out. And that final story in chapter 22, where Isaac is offered by Abraham on the altar to God. And God responds by sending a substitute. Wonderful passage. Now, notice the symmetry. For example, we had a sojourn in Egypt back in chapter 12, verse 10. We have a sojourn in Gerar. Both of those times we have a similar sort of taking place, where Abram says of his wife, she's not my wife, she's my sister. When it happens in chapter 20, you find out an additional detail that indeed she is the half-sister. She's both wife and half-sister of Abram. You say, well, which is it? And the answer is, in this case, was both. I suppose they did things like that back then, no longer today. And then you have two negotiation stories. Notice how they are in parallel, where in chapter 13 you have Lot and Abram. They're negotiating together about where to stay in the land, and they come to an agreement. And in chapter 18, verse 16, you have God and Abram are negotiating, where Abram is saying, look, are you going to destroy the city of Sodom if there are 50 righteous people? And God says, no, if there's 50 righteous, I won't. Well, how about 40? How about 30? How about 20? And comes all the way down to how about 10? And so there's a whole series of negotiations taking place. And both of these culminate in a rescue story. In chapter 14, Abram rescues Lot and the people of Sodom. And in chapter 19, it's angels that go down and rescue Lot and destroy Sodom. And what I want you to see is that each of these are in parallel, that they're organized, I think, chronologically, but more importantly, they are organized according to a topical symmetry that you ought to see. Now, what I want to do is look first of all at the rescue story here, and we're not going to talk about the rescue part, but it's while that's taking place that Abram comes back from having rescued Lot, and when he does, he comes back and he has this interaction with a character that is introduced here, but once we get out of chapter 14, he won't be mentioned almost at all in the pages of the Old Testament. He'll be one time in the Psalms, and we'll look at that in a moment. And you read that Melchizedek, king of Salem. Now, Salem sounds quite a bit like Jerusalem. It's like you know how we have a city in the United States called Las Vegas. And yet sometimes you leave the lost part out. You just say, oh, I'm going to Vegas. And I've actually been to, quote unquote, Vegas. Well, here you have a city named Jerusalem, but here the first part is left off. It's Salem. I think it's speaking of Jerusalem. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. And then we find out he was a priest of God Most High. Now, God Most High almost becomes a title. You have the word God, Elohim is the Hebrew word. Although in this case it's the shortened form of Elohim, it's El Elyon. That's how you say God Most High. And it's almost as though Melchizedek knew God by a slightly different title. And you find out that he was a priest of God Most High. Genesis has not made mention of any priests up to this time until you see this priest bringing bread and wine. And as soon as you see, wait, bread and wine, I'm going to read about that later in the pages of the Bible. Somebody who gives bread and wine in a symbolic ceremony to say, this is my body broken for you. This is the cup poured out for you. Jesus is going to do that. And so there's a sense in which this ancient priest king, notice he was both a king and a priest. Those are two titles that don't usually go together, especially in the pages of the Bible. But here was one who had the title of both priest and king. And of course, when you get to Jesus, again, you're going to see somebody who has the title of both priest and king, who gives bread and wine. And there's a contrast in Genesis 14, because earlier you had seen another king, a pagan king. The king, his name was Barak, king of Sodom, who had been taken into captivity by these pagan raiders. And Abraham, he was still known as Abram back then. Abram had gone to rescue Lot, and in rescuing Lot, he had rescued the king of Sodom. And so here's this king of Sodom, a city of sinful pleasure. And then by contrast now, we're introduced to this Melchizedek, king of Salem. And the word Salem, or shalom, we say, is the Hebrew word for peace. The king of Baran had come out to, the king of Sodom, Bera, had come out to meet Abram, and now Melchizedek also comes out to meet Abram. In Bera's case, he had said, look, you rescued us, and you recaptured all those riches that had been looted from us. You can keep the riches, just give back the people. And Abram had refused. Melchizedek is going to come. He offers not riches, he offers a blessing to Abram along with bread and wine, which might be a much greater group of riches than just things like gold and silver and things like that. As I said, Abram refused the offer of Bera. He said, "No, I'm not going to keep anything. I'm going to pay for the those that had come with him, sort of his, you could say, his military expenses. Those who had joined in to help in this military campaign to do this rescue, but he takes nothing for himself. But then he accepts gifts and blessings from Melchizedek, and indeed gives him a tenth, a tithe. That's what the word tithe means. It means a tenth. He gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything that he has, as if to say, "You represent God, and I am giving these things to God." Now, the next time we see Melchizedek will be Psalm chapter 110. And again, at that time, it's only going to be one verse, a chapter that is speaking messianically of the Son of David and how God is going to win and to conquer. But then Psalm 110, verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You, and the one he's been speaking to earlier, is one who is described as David's Lord. And he says, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." And then he goes on to say, and the Lord is at your right hand, and he's going to shatter kings in the day of his wrath. And you get down to verse 6, he'll shatter the chief men over a broad country, and about how he is going to win. And so there's that single reference that makes it a promise bound with an oath, that there's coming this one who will be a priest, like this priest that's introduced so briefly here in Genesis 14. And you get to the New Testament and you find out that's a picture of Jesus, who is both a king and a priest, but not a king or a priest like any other king or priest throughout any area of history, but a very different kind of king, a very different kind of priest. In the case of Bera, king of Salem, Abram returned all of his riches and people. In the case of Melchizedek, Abram gave to him the tithes of all the spoils of war. In the case of Bera, king of Sodom, he represents the city of man, whereas Melchizedek, he represents the city of God. And of course, Jesus is the one who comes from the city of God. He's the builder of that city. And so he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And here's where we see he gave him a tenth of all. Now, I want to go next. You have that Lot and Abram and story, and Abram rescuing Lot. But next week, we want to go to chapter 15, and here's where we'll be spending the rest of our time, where Abram's going to prepare a sacrifice for a covenant ceremony. Now, to get the point of this, you have to again remember that Abram has wanted an heir. He has been promised by God that he's going to have an heir, but there's one fundamental problem. His wife, Sarai, is barren. She can have no children, and she's been barren for her entire life. And when you first saw Lot, I think perhaps you were supposed to ask the question, well, is that going to be the promised heir? After all, he's related to Abram. He's a nephew. Abram's own father had died, and so Abram's become sort of the leader of the clan with Lot there. But then when they separate, it's evident, no, it's not going to be Lot, because heirs don't separate. The heir, it doesn't leave father and mother and go somewhere else. And so Lot won't work as the heir. And then as we come to this chapter, we're going to see that there's somebody named Eliezer of Damascus. He is the chief steward of Abram, and perhaps he will be the adopted heir. That was customary in the ancient world. If you couldn't have children, you would adopt somebody, perhaps a trusted servant, a trusted steward, and that person would become your legal son, and he would care for you in your old age, and then he would receive all that you had accumulated in life. Well, Genesis chapter 15 and verse 4, then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man, and he's just been introduced in the previous verse, this man, Eliezer of Damascus, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body. He shall be your heir. You're going to have a son, a physical son, Abram. Now, he doesn't say anything about Sarai here. That's going to come later. But here it's a son of Abram who will become your heir. And so I said, it's not going to be Lot, it's not going to be Eliezer. One from Abram's own body will be his heir. Verse 5, and he took him outside. This is God speaking to Abram. He took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars. Now, if I do this from South Florida, where we have lots of lights I live in a big city, and you go up and look in the sky, you can see a handful of stars if it's an exceptionally clear night. But this isn't like being out in the country in pre-industrial areas. Before electric lights had come around, you would go out into the night sky there, and there would be stars everywhere. And so he says, look toward the heavens and count the stars. Well, they are innumerable, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. You're going to have a multitude of descendants. And he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Again, another very cryptic line, something quoted many times in the New Testament to point out that we establish our relationship with God through faith, and that faith is reckoned as righteousness. That Abraham is credited with a righteousness that is not his own, as he believes in the promise of God. But our passage doesn't end there. He said to him, I am the Lord who brought you up out of Ur of the Chaldeans, this is the land where he had lived previously, to give you this land to possess it. And he, that is Abram, said, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? How do I know? No, he doesn't know God very well. He's heard the voice of God. God has told him to come to the place where he is. But he's still getting to know who God is. And so he's asking for certainty. How can I know this for sure? Verse 9, so he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And you say, what's this about? Well, this is the covenant ceremony. And we talked about this when we were looking at the Noahic covenant, the covenant that God made with Noah. This was grouped and understood as part of the culture of that day. Remember how you would cut a covenant. And so verse 10, he brought all these to him and cut them in two. That's what you do to make a covenant, and laid each half opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds. They're off to the side. And the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. And now we have the entry of Abram into this covenant ceremony, where we would take these animals, and you would kill them, and then you would cut them in two, so that you always cut a covenant. And then the parties who were entering into the covenant, and this is what guaranteed this is what sealed the ceremony, they would pass between the pieces as they recited the terms of the covenant. And so Abram sets forth, he gets ready the covenant, but then God comes. Verse 12, now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. This was not a comfortable sleep. This was a very restless sleep, because something shows up that frankly, Abram, it brought him fear. And God comes, and God begins to give him promises. This is not a safe God. This is a God who's very big and very powerful. And God promises that Abram's going to be buried at a good old age. He's pretty old now, but he's going to get older. But then God also speaks about Abram's descendants, how they will be strangers in a land that is not their own. about how God will judge that land in which they find themselves as strangers, and that in the fourth generation they will leave that land and they will return here to the land where Abram is now, the land of Canaan, and that this land God is going to give, but not yet. And the reason he won't give it yet is because the iniquity of the Amorites are another name for the Canaanites, those are the people that are living in this land right now, it has not yet been filled. But as it fills up, as their iniquity, as their sin comes to the point of demanding judgment, just at that time, God is going to bring the descendants of Abraham back into this land to bring about that judgment. Now, what God has just done, he's told us the story of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and even the book of Joshua, and maybe even a bit of Judges. He's just laid out the next 5 or 6 books of the Old Testament in describing this. And he's done so prophetically. Verse 17, it came about when the sun had set, that it was very dark. We already said a darkness had come. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. So Abraham had set up the covenant ceremony. God had caused a deep sleep to come upon him, so he's not moving. He may be restless, but he's not sleepwalking. And in the meantime, these two apparitions, a smoking oven, a flaming torch, they pass between the pieces. And I think everyone reading this understands that this somehow represents the presence of God, which is passing between the pieces. God is binding his words to Abraham with an oath, with a covenant, as God passes between the pieces. But here's the question. Why is the presence of God described as a smoking oven and a flaming torch? We're not going to see those terms used again. It is only here. And the answer, of course, is that when you refer to a smoking oven and a flaming torch, and you're writing this, because I believe that the book of Genesis was written by Moses, and his audience is the Israelites who have come out of Egypt in the Exodus. And every day, God takes on the form, he is manifested by a pillar of smoke, by a smoking oven. And every night he is manifested, his presence is manifested and leading the Israelites by a pillar of fire, a flaming torch. And God is being described in the very terms with which they are familiar in seeing the presence of God. And that's the same God that made a promise with Abram that they are in the process of seeing fulfilled in their day. Verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Remember, if we want to be very literal, we would say he cut a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. All these people, because all these people were already living in the land. God says, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan, but it's already fully inhabited by all these other people. But the land that has been given to them will eventually be taken from them and given to you. And notice how that goes from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, that land from the river of Egypt, that's like the outer borders of Egypt. There were actually some ports there. Went all the way down to the edge of the what we call the Gulf of Aqaba. They called that whole area the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. All the way to the river, the great river, the Euphrates. That is the land that we're eventually going to see that will describe Solomon's kingdom. Not that that's going to be Israel, but Solomon will exercise lordship. There will be other kings there, and they're all going to be giving tribute to Solomon, so that his authority will extend throughout those areas. Now you say, but wait a minute, this is an eternal covenant, Is that portion of land going to be given back to Israel or given to dominion to them in the future? Is that what we're to expect for the future kingdom? And I say, well, no, because the future kingdom is going to be much bigger than that. You see, get to the New Testament, I read in Revelation chapter 11, verse 15, there's this wonderful vision where there have been a whole series of seals that are broken and then trumpets that are blown, and you come to the final trumpet. The seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom," not just from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt, "the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever." The kingdom is going to get much bigger than you ever saw in the days of Solomon. And that comes to us as no surprise, because Jesus said, look, one greater than Solomon is here before you today.